People are accustomed to looking for signs of the end of the world, disasters and wars in them, but there is something else. Something much more specific and much more disturbing. Ancient biblical texts repeatedly describe an event that has been repeated throughout history with uncanny accuracy. Entire nations and states seem disappeared as if they had never existed, not gradually, not over centuries. Sometimes it happened almost instantly. In the book of Revelation and the prophetic books of the Old Testament, there are symbols that most people read as metaphors, but if you look more closely, these texts do not describe abstract spiritual events. They describe the fall of real countries. And what is most interesting is that the structure of these prophecies is always the same. First, signs appear. Then a crisis develops. And after that, a state that seemed unshakable simply ceases to exist. And if we apply this biblical model to the modern world, the picture becomes very disturbing. Because there are at least 3 countries that analysts, historians, and even theologians are talking about today. Countries that could repeat the scenario described in the Bible thousands of years ago. And that is why it is important to understand one thing right now. Biblical texts almost never name states directly. They speak in symbols. But these symbols have very specific characteristics. And when you start to decipher them, it becomes clear why some civilizations disappeared suddenly and why history may repeat itself again. Why the Bible speaks of the fall of states. Most people read the Bible as a spiritual book, but prophetic texts have never been just about the human soul. They have always been about the fate of civilizations as well. If you look closely at the Old Testament, you will see the same pattern described there. When a people or a state reaches a certain point of moral, political, or spiritual decay, a process begins that the prophets called, very simply, the fall of a city. And this is not a poetic image. This is how Babylon, Nineveh, and Tyre disappeared. They were once the centers of the world. Powerful empires. Places where the fate of continents was decided. Today, only ruins remain. The prophets described one curious detail. The fall of states almost never began with war. First, the internal structure of society changed. Moderation disappeared. Responsibility disappeared. The ability to see the consequences of one's own decisions disappeared. And then a symbol appears in the texts, repeated over and over again. A city that has lost its foundation. This is how the Bible describes the moment when a system begins to collapse from within. Outwardly, the state may appear strong, the economy may be functioning, the army may be powerful, but the foundation is already cracking. In the book of the prophet Jeremiah, there is a line that many theologians consider to be the key to understanding this logic. A people that has lost its understanding will be uprooted. This means a very simple thing. States do not disappear when they are attacked by enemies. They disappear when they lose the ability to maintain their own order. And that is why biblical texts say so much about signs before the fall. Because before a country disappears from the map, there is always a certain sequence of events, symbols, signals, warnings. And when historians began to compare these biblical descriptions with the modern world, they noticed one disturbing detail. Some of these signs are already visible today. And that is why a question arises that would have seemed impossible before. Can entire countries disappear in the modern world as suddenly as it has happened many times in history? Because if you look at the symbols described in Revelation, there is a hint of 3 different scenarios for the fall, and each of them is beginning to manifest itself in the real world today. How the Bible describes the disappearance of a country. The prophetic books of the Bible almost never say directly, "This country will disappear." Prophecies work differently. They describe a process that is impossible not to recognize when it begins. And most interestingly, this process almost always has 3 stages. First, a crack appears in the system. This is the moment when the state still looks strong, the army is in place, the economy is working, people live their usual lives. But the prophets spoke of another indicator. They looked at the state of society. In the book of Isaiah, there is a phrase that sounds very harsh. When a nation calls darkness light, and light darkness, judgment begins. Historians have noticed a strange pattern. Before the fall of empires, almost always the same change occurs. Society begins to lose its bearings. The clear line between right and profitable disappears. Between justice and power, this is the first stage. The second stage is described in the Bible with a symbol that many do not understand: a divided city. This means that the country begins to fight with itself, not necessarily because of war, because of politics, because of ideology, because of deep internal conflicts. History knows dozens of examples when states collapsed, not because of an external enemy, but because of internal divisions. It is at this moment that the prophets begin to speak of the third stage: suddenness. In the book of Revelation, there is a line that is repeated several times. And in 1 hour, the great city fell. This is not a literal hour. It is an image of the moment when a process that has been going on for years suddenly reaches a point of no return. And a state that seemed unshakable yesterday begins to crumble. This is how empires that once ruled half the world disappeared. And when researchers began to compare these biblical symbols with modern geopolitics, a very disturbing hypothesis emerged. There are several countries today that strangely fit the biblical model of the fall of a state. That is why some analysts talk about 3 possible scenarios. The first is a country that could disappear due to internal division. The second is a state that risks losing its form due to economic and political overload. And the third scenario is the most dangerous, when a great state may disappear not because of defeat, but because of a sudden transformation of the world around it. And it is with the first such scenario that it all begins. The first country. When the state begins to fight itself, there is one type of state collapse that the Bible describes particularly accurately. Not invasion, not natural disaster, not even economic collapse. The most dangerous scenario begins when a country starts fighting with itself. There is a phrase in the gospel that is often read as a moral metaphor, but if you look at it more closely, it sounds like a political law of history. Every kingdom divided against itself will be laid waste. These words sound simple, but history shows how accurate they are. This is how the Roman Empire disappeared. This is how the Soviet Union collapsed. This is how states that seemed unshakable yesterday were destroyed. Not because of a single blow, because of an internal rift. First, 2 worlds emerge within one country. 2 truths. 2 realities. People cease to see a common future. In prophetic books, this state is described by the symbol of a divided city. Historians say that when society reaches this point, the state can continue to exist for years, sometimes for decades, but the foundation has already been destroyed. And that is why some analysts today are talking about one country that is dangerously close to this scenario. This is a country with a huge economy, a powerful army, global influence, but within it, there is a growing level of polarization that the world has not seen in a long time. Political camps are no longer listening to each other. Society is divided into almost incompatible groups. Even history and values are beginning to be interpreted differently. And that is why some researchers of biblical texts draw attention to one parallel. The prophetic books often mention a great city or a great power that seems unshakable, but begins to crack due to internal conflict. And if this process reaches a critical point, the state does not necessarily disappear literally. It may lose its form, it may split up, it may weaken, or it may lose the role it played in the world. And it is this scenario that some analysts today cautiously associate with one of the most influential states on the planet, the United States of America, not because the country is weak. On the contrary, history shows a strange thing. The greatest powers do not fall when they are weak. They fall when they lose their internal unity. And if biblical logic really works, then this is only the first type of scenario, because there is another one, and it is much more dangerous. This is a scenario in which a country can lose not only its stability, but also the very possibility of existing in the form in which the world knows it. The second country. When the empire becomes too heavy for itself. There is another scenario for the disappearance of states, which the Bible describes no less clearly. It is not internal division, nor is it a sudden catastrophe. It is system overload. When a state grows so large and its structure becomes so complex that it begins to collapse under its own weight. In the book of the prophet Daniel, there is a very famous image, a giant statue made of different metals. Gold, silver, copper, iron. It looks majestic, invincible, but its weakness lies in its foundation. The legs are made of a mixture of iron and clay, materials that cannot hold together, and when a blow comes, the statue does not just crack. It falls apart completely. Theologians have been trying to understand the meaning of this image for centuries, and many of them have come to the same conclusion. It is a symbol of a state or union of states that have enormous power but remain unstable inside, a union where different parts do not have true unity, where economies, cultures, and political systems pull in different directions. History has already seen similar structures. Empires consisting of dozens of nations, alliances that seemed stable until a crisis came. And then it turned out that the system was too complex to respond quickly. That is why some researchers of biblical symbols draw attention to one modern structure. It is not a single country in the classical sense. It is a large union of states that influences the economy and politics of half the planet. The European Union, its strength lies in its scale. Its weakness lies in its diversity. Dozens of languages, different economic levels, different political cultures. And when the system is stable, this diversity looks like an advantage. But in times of global crisis, it can become a source of tension. In biblical symbolism, this is very reminiscent of the same image, iron mixed with clay. A strong structure that cannot completely merge into a single whole. And if such a system begins to lose its balance, it does not necessarily disappear instantly. It may begin to fall apart. Alliances may change form. States may leave. The political structure may cease to exist in the form in which the world knows it. This is exactly how history has already seen the disappearance of large political systems. And this leads to the third scenario, the most unexpected one, because sometimes a state does not fall due to internal conflict and does not collapse under its own weight. Sometimes it simply finds itself in a world that has suddenly changed so much that the old empires can no longer exist in it. The third country. When the world changes faster than the state. History knows another type of state disappearance, the quietest, the least noticeable, and at the same time, one of the most radical. A country may not lose a war. It may not fall apart due to internal conflict. It may not go bankrupt. It simply loses its place in the new reality. In the book of Revelation, there is one symbol that has long remained a mystery to theologians. The great city that in one moment lost its glory. There is no description of war. There is no description of destruction. There is another detail. The world continues to move forward, but the center of power is changing. This is very reminiscent of what has already happened in history. Once upon a time, the world revolved around Byzantium, then around the Ottoman Empire, then around the British Empire. Each of them seemed irreplaceable, but there came a moment when the geopolitical axis of the world shifted and the state that had ruled global processes yesterday suddenly found itself on the periphery of history. It is this scenario that some analysts today associate with another great power, Russia. It is a country with a huge territory, colossal resources, a powerful history. But the history of empires shows one thing: territory alone does not guarantee stability. Empires begin to change shape when the world enters a new era. The economy changes, technology changes, the balance of power changes, and if a state fails to adapt to the new reality, it can lose its role much faster than seems possible. In biblical symbolism, this looks like the moment when a great city suddenly loses its influence, not because of a single blow, but because history moves on. And that is why some researchers say that the greatest changes in states do not take place on the battlefield. They occur at the moment when the old world ceases to exist. And if you look closely at the biblical texts, you can notice one detail: prophecies almost never focus on countries themselves. They talk about the consequences for humanity. Because when the balance of power in the world changes, it's not just the map that changes, the era itself changes. What the Bible really describes. There is one mistake that almost everyone makes when reading biblical prophecies. People try to find specific names of countries, but prophetic texts work quite differently. The Bible almost never says, "This country will fall in such and such a year." It describes the patterns of history. And when you start reading these texts carefully, it becomes clear that the prophecies are not about individual states. They talk about types of civilizations. Some states collapse because of division, others because of system overload, others because of a change in the era itself. That is why the biblical prophets never tried to predict the exact map of the world. They showed the mechanism of the fall of empires, and this mechanism repeats itself in a surprising way. When society ceases to see the line between truth and profit, a crack begins to form. When political systems become too complex, overload occurs. When the world enters a new technological or economic era, old centers of power can lose their place. And that is why the Bible speaks of the fall of great cities as if it were a natural law of history. No empire is eternal. No system remains unchanged. Sometimes this happens gradually, and sometimes it happens so quickly that a generation of people does not have time to realize that the world has already changed. That is why biblical texts constantly repeat one idea. So the real question is never asked, which country will fall? The real question is different. Does humanity notice the signs that appear before the change of eras? Because when history reaches a certain point, the world map can change faster than people are ready for. And this is exactly what the prophets warned about thousands of years ago. But there is one more detail that is often overlooked. The most important part of biblical prophecies was never about fear. It was about understanding how history works. And if you understand this principle, it becomes obvious. When empires change, it is not only politics that changes. The fate of entire generations changes. And that is why the prophets spoke about these things so seriously. Because when the world begins to move into a new era, what matters most is not which countries are strong. It is whether people are ready to live in a new reality. There is one detail that makes biblical prophecy so disturbing. They almost never speak of the future as something distant. The prophets always described history as if it were moving in waves, and every wave sooner or later reaches the shore. Empires rise, empires fall. This happened to Babylon, to Rome, to states that once ruled half the world. At one time they seemed eternal, but the Bible constantly repeats the same idea. No earthly system is unshakable. That is why the prophets did not try to scare people. They tried to open their eyes to the patterns of history. When societies lose their bearings, division begins. When systems become too complex, fragility appears. When the world enters a new era, old centers of power may disappear. Sometimes slowly, and sometimes so quickly that it seems as if it happened overnight. This is how the Bible describes the fall of great cities, not just as a political event, but as a turning point in history. And if you look closely at the modern world, you can see that many of the processes that the prophet spoke of are becoming visible again today. The world is changing rapidly, the balance of power is shifting, old systems are under intense pressure, and the main question is not just which countries will change. The real question is much deeper. Does humanity understand that every era has its time, and that the moment of transition always comes unexpectedly? If this topic has made you look at history from a different angle, subscribe to the channel. Here, symbols, prophecies, and hidden patterns that most people simply do not notice are analyzed, because sometimes the most important things in history become clear only to those who are willing to look deeper than the surface of events.